All right, friends. All right, I'll just point myself this way. We'll just ignore the rest of that space. Oh, that works. Camera's right there too. So I was pondering. I'm like, do I just shelf the teaching for a different week? If it wasn't for the fact that in 2 weeks we have our next gathering is Caleb's special ceremony, and I'm not sure this is the right teaching for that. So I'm going to go ahead and go with it. And again, maybe some people will watch it later, and otherwise, y'all can be the reporters out to the rest of the community. All right, so growing up, my dad was a regular, loving, goofy, playful presence in my life and in the life of my two siblings. My childhood memories of him include learning to sing as he strummed his guitar when I was very small and played folk songs by John Denver and Peter, Paul, and Mary. I remember attending baseball games with him. He's still an avid Padres fan, likes to go to games. As an involved parent and a chaperone to the youth organizations I was involved in, he would often disarm folks by pulling out of the pocket of his suit jacket a silly nose of some kind, putting it in the center of his face. So sometimes it would be like a clown nose. Other times it was like an animal nose, like an elephant trunk or a toucan beak, which of course as a teenager I found super embarrassing, but also humorous. As an attorney, I believe he may have also occasionally done this in court when he thought he could get away with it. Dad also told us stories regularly about his life, stories about growing up on a chicken farm in Southern California. He'd tell us about horseback riding as a teenager. He told us about the time he saw a young Martin Luther King Jr. come speak at his college when he was a student at UCLA, how impressed he was with him. But there was one area of Dad's life that he didn't talk about a lot. And intuitively, we kids understood not to ask a lot of questions. It was the period in which my dad flew helicopters in Vietnam. He was a young man at the time, right out of college, newly married to my mother, and after he graduated from college, he reported to officer training school right away, with my mother following along. The young married men there who were being prepared to be sent overseas were all told to get their wives pregnant before they left, and my parents complied, leading to the birth of my older brother. While Dad was able to remain in the States for the birth and the early months of his first child's life, before too long he was deployed, leaving my mom with her infant son to wait for him here and pray he would return. At least half of the men that my dad went to flight school with didn't come back from the war. Many of the wives and young mothers who were my mom's peers and companions in that season became young widows. Dad did thankfully make it home, and a handful of years later I was born, and then eventually my younger sister. Though Dad didn't talk about his service very much, there were times that we noticed it was something he carried with him. Probably the most vivid memory I have of this came when we went as a family in the late 90s to see that new hit movie about World War II, Saving Private Ryan. If you've ever seen the movie, it begins with this horrifically vivid battle scene as the U.S. soldiers take the Omaha beach in Normandy, France. Director Steven Spielberg had set out to begin the film by bringing the brutality of warfare to the big screen in a very immersive way, which was considered groundbreaking for war films at the time. And while this was intended to be difficult for anyone to watch because war is difficult, before long, our family understood that for my dad, it was something different. As the scene unfolded, his body started shaking. Before long, he seemed to fall out of his seat, as if he was having a seizure, or perhaps a heart attack. It was terrifying. Thankfully, neither of those was the case, but his body was under significant stress. Stress that we would eventually come to understand was a symptom of psychological trauma. So my dad is in his late 70s. His service in Vietnam was over 50 years ago. And yet in this last year, my father has finally been formally diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. After 50 years, through the Veterans Administration, he is now at last receiving real treatment for the impact of these traumatic experiences on him. And though in many ways he has led a productive, fruitful life, for this area that has continued to be deeply troubling, often in ways I think he kept to himself and didn't really share with us, but have no doubt impacted him profoundly, there is finally hope that he's beginning to experience some relief and some healing. Well, I start with this story about my dad and his experiences of dealing with the trauma of combat because it connects with the theme of this new teaching series that we're going to be engaging this fall, all the way up to and through the retreat. And today I'm beginning the series I'm calling Hurt to Whole. Hurt to Whole. It's drawing from the, if you know, as many of you know, over the last year, I was part of a certificate program through San Francisco Theological Seminary. And the certificate focus was on trauma and spiritual care. And that drew from the emerging field of trauma studies, as well as other disciplines like theology and pastoral care, to equip those of us in the program to participate in better understanding trauma and also hopefully cultivating pathways of healing and resilience for folks we work with. Now, there's a reason I chose to take significant time over the last year, out of my weekends and my evenings, to attend these virtual classes, to engage a lot of reading, to complete these projects that the class required, and that all didn't really have anything to do with my dad. Because as of this month, it's actually been 10 years since the first small group gathering that would eventually be called Haven in my Berkeley living room. And over the last 10 years, the theme of trauma has come up again and again. You see, I started Haven with the intention of beginning a safe community for folks who may not have been able to find safe, spiritual, Jesus-centered spaces in the past, particularly those in the LGBTQ+ community, as well as family members and allies. I myself, when I came here 10 years ago, had recently been exiled from the community of churches I had called home and I had hoped to pastor in over my stance on LGBTQ inclusion. And so I wanted to create a safe place where not only I could persist in Jesus-centered faith, but others who had experienced similar exclusion could as well. So many of us who found ourselves in this Haven space over the last decade have had experiences of exclusion, experiences we might consider traumatic. Others who found their way here may have connected from a different background, but whatever they brought them here often included a desire to experience safety after they had had experiences in potentially spiritual communities that didn't feel safe for some reason. And yet, though we have talked about trauma through the years, though that language has clearly resonated for folks talking about church trauma, personal traumas, or for some, the trauma of living in a marginalized identity, reckoning with the collective traumas of racism, ableism, poverty, so on. There hasn't always been clarity on how we can move together beyond the trauma. How do we become more than simply a trauma bonding group? Has been a question that I think we've wrestled with. How do we move beyond a fear of just triggering one another to engaging a space of freedom and hope and maybe even healing? These were some of the questions that after years of pastoring this little community led me to pursue some deeper learning in this emerging area of trauma studies, including trying to learn how people and communities can move into greater wholeness and health. And I'm so glad I did it. Because while this program opened my eyes and my mind to much deeper understanding of the impact of trauma, which at times was difficult because this stuff is difficult, it also gave me genuine hope that healing and resiliency and growth are within all of our reach. And so over the coming weeks, I'm hoping I can share at least a few of the insights and practices that I've learned over the last year through this program as we consider together the impact of trauma on ourselves, on our communities, and those around us, as well as how we might engage our Jesus-centered faith in a way that brings healing and wholeness, that helps us move from hurt to whole. So today we're just going to lay the foundation together. We're going to start by considering a basic understanding of what trauma is, what it might mean to be trauma-informed in our approach to building spiritual community. We'll even consider how Jesus might be particularly helpful in pointing the way in this. So essentially today in this introductory talk, I'm hoping we can engage 3 core questions. And we won't be able to answer any of them exhaustively. Just to be clear, I have lots of books I can refer you to if you want more information. But we can at least touch on some essentials for each of them. And the 3 questions I want to engage today are these. What is trauma? How does it show up? What does it look like? And how might a sensitivity to trauma impact our perspectives on others? Okay, so those are kind of the things we're going to be looking at. Before we get into any specifics, I just want to name that the very nature of the topic we're engaging itself can be very difficult. I just want to name that, especially for those of us who are actively living with the effects of a traumatic experience. And so while this is always true, I just want to be, this is what I'm about to say should be true all the time, but I want to begin this series reminding us all to take care of ourselves through these conversations. And so if at any point I'm talking, you feel in yourself a stress response showing up in your body, please take care of yourself in whatever way you need to do. That could mean closing your eyes, taking some deep breaths. It could mean getting up, walking around a little bit, stepping outside if you need to. I've also put a kind of toolbox for self-soothing here on this back table, and I will be bringing this throughout the series and potentially adding to it, okay? So what we've got here, we've got soft blankets, we've got fidgets, we've got coloring things you could do, okay? Because sometimes when we're in distress, it's helpful to have something soft to touch, something distracting to do, something tactical or physical to touch. So throughout this series, we'll have these items in the back. If at any time you ever need to take a moment and see if something there will help ground you, you are welcome to do that. So to begin, what is trauma? In recent years, in our current cultural environment, there's been a surge of references to this word trauma in our everyday conversations, but do we actually know what specifically it involves? What's the difference between just a hard, terrible day and a traumatic day? Sometimes it's confusing because I think this language has become so culturally common, it gets overused a bit and can become kind of fuzzy. But scientists who've done a lot of research on trauma and its impact on us would generally say that what makes a difficult experience a traumatic one generally has to do with how it impacts our body and our brain, specifically our central nervous system, the part of us that processes emotion and regulates our capacity to feel and to deal with life. And the reality is all of us have experiences of life being terrible. We all have bad moments, we have bad days, sometimes we have bad weeks, even months. But this alone doesn't create trauma. Our bodies and minds are actually wired to be remarkably resilient. And so generally, when we experience something difficult or unpleasant, we feel it, but then the experience ends and we feel something different. Okay, the stressful exchange at work, the painful fall from the bicycle, the unexpected bill that arrives in the mail might be very challenging in the moment that we're dealing with it, but then before too long, the issue resolves. We move on. We have a much better day at work, or our bruises and our egos heal after falling off the bike, or we find a way to cover that unexpected bill and we move forward. And if we notice, we might even be grateful for the way that our body and our mind can reset as we have a more pleasant experience. But sometimes a negative experience is so negative that it overwhelms our capacity to absorb it and to process it. And that impacts our capacity to move on from it. Dr. Judith Herman is one of the foundational authors in the field of trauma, and she describes what makes an experience traumatic in this way. She says traumatic events are extraordinary not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. That's what makes them extraordinary. Unlike commonplace misfortunes, traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily integrity or a close personal encounter with violence or death. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the responses of catastrophe. Similarly, theologian Serene Jones, who's done a lot of work in the area of thinking through the implications of trauma on our connection to the divine, she defines a traumatic experience this way. A traumatic event is one in which a person or persons perceives themselves or others as threatened by an external force that seeks to annihilate them and against which they are unable to resist and which overwhelms their capacity to cope. Now, both of these definitions speak to a common factor that's generally there in experiences of trauma. An experience is often traumatic when we feel helpless in it. We feel isolated, we feel attacked, like some core part of ourself could be destroyed, whether that's our physical body or it could be an important part of our identity, like our sexuality. Experiences that threaten our sense of self in a way that deprives us of agency often end up creating trauma. But the experience of helplessness is not the only component of a hard experience becoming a trauma. Another very foundational figure in the field of trauma studies is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And he names the impact of the event on us as an important part of the experience of trauma. He says it this way: we have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past, it is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, body, and brain and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. So this imprint that Dr. van der Kolk describes is highlighting what sets a traumatic experience apart from a difficult but not traumatic experience. When a person experiences the kind of helplessness, fear of annihilation that we've already described, their capacity to process and experience and to cope can be overwhelmed, and something in their body and mind can't respond the way they typically would, and they get stuck. The negative experience doesn't resolve. It stays with them. It leaves an imprint. And that imprint remains even after the incident is over and the specific threat is removed. So Dr. van der Kolk is one of the pioneers in this field, and in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, maybe you've heard of it, he talks about his earliest experiences identifying this imprint. And it was actually with people like my father. In fact, it was in the wake of Vietnam that the language of trauma actually developed. It was through working with Vietnam vets that psychologists first identified what would be called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It's not that those who cared for the life of the mind, psychologists had never observed the symptoms we now describe as part of PTSD, but they hadn't really understood them. In World War I, soldiers suffering under the stress of combat were called shell-shocked and often judged as being weak. Women who suffered under all too common sexual violence in a patriarchal world for generations were labeled as hysterical and judged negatively for the way they responded to the violence that they had experienced and how it impacted their capacity to cope. It was finally in the wake of Vietnam, though, that doctors started to think about what was happening to people who had suffered this stress in a deeper way. And they started to understand that these experiences had changed the way people's brains and bodies were functioning. And so doctors like van der Kolk understood that we have evolved with an important evolutionary mechanism in our brains to detect threat and protect us from it. It's a survival mechanism. In the base part of our human brains, we share characteristics with other animals. Sometimes folks will call this part of our brain the lizard brain, or the cockroach brain, or the animal brain, depending on who's talking. And its job is to notice when we are under threat and to adjust, almost instinctually, so that when we suffer threat, we can adapt to it. So like an animal in the wild, this part of our brain tells us when we're under threat to do generally one of three things: to fight, to flee, or to freeze. There's also fawn. We won't get into that one as well right now. But yes, to fight, to flee, or to freeze are typically the core responses. Think of the dog becoming ferocious when an intruder is at the door. That's the fight response, right? Or the deer running away at the sound of someone approaching. That's the flight or flee response. And then there's the possum playing dead as it senses a potential predator. That's the freeze response. In the same way, our brain, without us even thinking about it, can cause us to react in the face of threat with one or more of these responses. And in the case of trauma, this part of our brain activates, and then it keeps reactivating, even after the specific threat is gone. So when my dad saw that movie, it did not matter that it had been over 20 years since he had seen combat. It didn't matter that he was now in a safe, climate-controlled movie theater with his family, not the jungle of Vietnam. Though the actual threat had passed, being immersed in the film triggered the part of his brain with the same threat response he had developed in Vietnam. The response that his body had wisely cultivated to protect him was now overperforming in a way that made life difficult for him. Of course, it's not just Vietnam vets who experience this phenomenon. Though doctors began with noticing the reality with these veterans, as they came to understand more what was happening, they looked around and they noticed the response in all kinds of people. Women suffering violence from their domestic partners. Children experiencing violence or neglect from their caregivers. Families coping with the violence of their loved ones caught in addiction. Individuals suffering under a long-term, ongoing, persistent kind of violence of an oppressive system, like racism, like poverty, like ableism, and so on. All of these experiences can create that feeling of helplessness and overwhelm our capacities to cope. All of them can be traumatizing. So that's what trauma is. How does it show up? What impact does the imprint make on the way a person lives while they're dealing with trauma? We'll just briefly go over a very few of the most common things we might see when someone is in a trauma response. There are others, but we'll just go over some of the most typical. First, one way trauma can show up is through excessive vigilance, or what doctors call hyperarousal. Hyperarousal. This is where that animal part of the brain continues to send the message that a threat is present, you're in danger, and the person's fight or flight responses are very triggered. And so this can look like bursts of anger that are just shocking. It can look like reactivity, volatility, people who are generally mild-mannered, all of a sudden responding violently. And that's obviously can make it very difficult for a person who's being activated so regularly this way to maintain healthy, loving relationships in this state. Another way that trauma can show up is kind of looks like the opposite, which is numbness, or what doctors would call dissociation. For these folks, they're getting stuck in the freeze response. They're like becoming the possum over and over again. So their brains are responding to threat by shutting things down. That could look like losing their capacity to communicate. At times they just might not, if they're in a severe trauma response, they just might not be able to speak clearly. This can look like they can often feel disconnected from their bodies. They may at times experience kind of seeing themselves from the outside. You hear people in a dissociative state kind of talk about seeing themselves in third person, or like watching from the ceiling. There can be confusion. There can often be memory loss, particularly around the traumatic events themselves, as their brain is kind of like blocking the memory to try to protect them. So that's another way, numbness. A third way this can show up is replaying the trauma. Often there's a loop that is kind of happening. And so that can look in different ways. It might be somebody keeps telling the story over and over and over again. I've heard some people wonder if after the event that happened with with our former president have an assassination attempt. He kept talking about it. He kept talking about it. Kept telling the story that may be a traumatic response that's happening. It can also show up with regular intrusive memories. Like you're just in the middle of something and the memory just keeps coming into your mind that keep replaying. Nightmares that recur over and over. And this also can be enacted through habits and patterns that seem to replicate the experience. So think of the woman who has suffered in an abusive domestic relationship, and then when that relationship is over, continues to find partners who kind of replicate the same harm. And then another final way I'll name, isolation and withdrawal is another way that trauma can show up. So as folks begin to identify that being in the world is very triggering, that it often, starts alerting their brain that they're in danger, they may just start to withdraw, to not do experiences, to not be around people, because it's too difficult. They're trying to avoid. But that also then, of course, makes it very difficult to build new connections with others that could actually be helpful, or to maintain ongoing relationships. So those are some of the ways trauma shows up. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about how it shows up. Now, before we end, I want us to consider briefly how this information might impact the way we relate to one another or to others we meet. How might a sensitivity to trauma impact our perspective on others? Well, we are a Jesus-centered community, and so I want to first answer that question in part by actually looking at a couple of incidences in the life of Jesus, as reported by the Gospels. So specifically, we'll look at a couple brief passages that appear in the 9th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. I'll take us through these passages, and then we'll consider why they might be relevant. So first, starting with Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax booth. "Follow me," he said to him. So he got up and followed him. And as Jesus was having a meal in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard this, he said, "Well, those who are healthy don't need a physician, but those who are sick do. Go and learn what this saying means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then Matthew goes on to relate a few incidences of Jesus actually demonstrating his commitment to being a healer. As he heals a bleeding woman, he brings a girl back from the brink of death, he restores sight to a blind man, he restores speech to someone who is mute. All of that happens as Matthew 9 continues. And then at the end of the chapter, Matthew shares this anecdote I want to look at. Starting in verse 35, "Then Jesus went throughout all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were bewildered and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest-ready fields.'" Okay, what do these stories have to do with trauma? For me, in both of them, I see Jesus able to see something that others seem to miss. In the first story, we see Jesus look at this tax collector, or the people that are called like sinners, like sex workers we know that Jesus hung out with. People that the self-righteous of Jesus' day viewed as just scum, bad people, people who should be avoided. Jesus should not be inviting Matthew to be one of his followers, and he certainly should not be eating at his house. But he sees these as people who need help, people who have wounding, people who are in some way unwell. He's talking about being a physician to bring care. Perhaps he's sensitive to the impact of trauma in these folks' lives. And so he sees them not as villains to be avoided, but as folks in need of healing. He sees them as folks in need of care. He longs for them to experience mercy and compassion, not to sacrifice their own sense of self out of obedience, but to be given what they need to be restored to life. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, he quotes. In a similar way, when Jesus sees the crowds at the end of the chapter, he sees them as being like a sheep without a shepherd. It's as if he understands the trauma of neglect, that all of us need caregiving. He grieves the way that these people have not been cared for well. And he longs for the divine to provide caregivers, shepherds for these lost sheep, workers to bring in the harvest. I share both of these incidences because I believe Jesus here is modeling what now many trauma specialists are trying to call people into. I think he is modeling what it means to be trauma-informed. Okay? Jesus has a trauma-informed sensibility in how he responds to people. You might say that multiple millennia before scientists would actually coin the term trauma, Jesus was already a trauma-informed rabbi. So what does it actually mean to be trauma-informed? Well, a core foundational piece I want to end with today is about how we regard others, how we become less like those Pharisees in our story and more like Jesus. And one important, simple way we can do this is to reframe our perspective when we encounter people who might be behaving in a way that we find troubling. The move is to move from asking, "What's wrong with you?" to "What happened to you?" From "What's wrong with you?" to "What happened to you?" What's wrong with you is a character judgment. It's the kind of question that the religious people of Jesus' day are thinking when they see people like Matthew, the tax collector. What's wrong with you, Matthew, that you would betray your Jewish neighbors, that you would sell us out to Rome, that you would fleece us and make money on our behalf? What's wrong with you that that is what you would choose to do? But Jesus sees beyond that. He doesn't lead with judgment, but compassion and curiosity. These folks aren't just sinners. They're hurt human beings who need restoration and repair. These crowds are neglected without real leadership and care. By moving from "What's wrong with you?" to "What happened to you?" we can lean into compassion, curiosity, and care, the same care of as Jesus. It's not the end point. To be clear, this is just the starting point. But it is an important start that allows us to begin to see past someone's triggered behavior, even behavior that really troubles us, which frankly, often when folks are in trauma response, their behavior can be really difficult. But asking what happened helps us see beyond that, see more of the whole person behind the behavior. We can move from distancing ourselves from others and pushing them away to opening ourselves up to learn and to possibly participate in another's healing journey. When Jesus looked at the crowds of his day, he grieved. How there were so few shepherds for these sheep. There were so few workers available to bring in the harvest. Today, I wonder if Jesus might regard our crowds in similar ways. We live in a world with a lot of violence, a lot of fragility, and sadly, a lot of trauma. There are the personal traumas many of us have experienced. There are the collective traumas. We all just lived through a planet-wide traumatizing experience of a global pandemic that assaulted all of our senses of identity and ways of life as a collective. We are all still recovering from that, and as a Haven community, as we can see today, we are still recovering from that. And so I wonder if Jesus might look at our world today and say, the trauma is significant, but the trauma-informed caregivers are few. Right? The trauma is significant, and the trauma-informed caregivers are few. As much as our world has a lot of traumatized people, I think we've also got a lot of "what's wrong with you" kind of responses happening. In our political discourse, in our social media feeds, in our interactions on the BART or at the workplace, and even sometimes it can happen here at church. We may find ourselves defaulting to that, "what's wrong with you" frustration with one another. But I think Jesus, as well as our trauma theory teachers, are calling us to do better. I think we're called to be part of the trauma-informed workforce that the Spirit is raising up and sending out like workers to the harvest to meet our neighbors not with judgment, but with curiosity and care. To ask not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and perhaps eventually, how can I help? This is what I hope we can grow in during the weeks to come and beyond as we continue to build this Haven community. There's lots more to say. We will explore more about ways we can connect with that healing journey in ourselves and others in future weeks, but I want to end today with just an opportunity for some prayer and reflection before we discuss, okay? So today I want to end with giving us an opportunity to notice places where we may have experienced Jesus or the divine, the Spirit, however it's helpful for you to name it, extending this kind of care to us. So I'm going to invite you into like a moment of kind of meditation, prayer, reflection. I'll invite you to close your eyes if that's helpful, or soften your gaze. And I'm going to invite you to consider if you've ever had an experience where you have encountered Jesus's or God's trauma-informed care. Perhaps it's something you experienced directly through a prayer time, a spiritual encounter, a moment of worship, a word of encouragement you sensed in your spirit coming from God. It also may have been experienced through the presence of another, a family member, a friend, a Haven community member, a caregiver, or a provider, a health provider, extending to you compassion that you didn't expect. However it came, I invite you to remember and consider what it felt like to be seen in a way you needed to be seen. Let's just take a moment to consider if we have a moment like that. What did it feel like to be seen in a way you needed to be seen? What opened up for you? What shifted when that happened? How did it feel in your body to be received in that care? And if you can't recall that kind of experience, I invite you to name that right now to the divine, to the Spirit, and invite God to hold that with you. Perhaps even showing you the love, care, and compassion of Jesus for you right here and now. Jesus, I thank you that I believe you are the great trauma-informed caregiver, that you see our hurt, not just our behavior, that you ask not what's wrong with you, but what's happened, that you have space to hold the happenings with us. I pray that we would have moments of encounter like that with you, for the spaces we have experienced being seen in a special way that we needed to be seen. We give thanks. And I also pray for more of that. And I also ask that in the weeks and months and beyond to come, we as a community could grow in providing trauma-informed care. May we be some of the workers your Spirit is raising up, because the trauma is great, but the workers are few. May we participate in that work, even when it's scary. May we also stand in the hope that trauma is not the end of the story. There is healing. There is resilience. There is life to be lived. Amen. All right, friends. So we'll chat for about 10 minutes. We can probably just be one group. And then Drenande will come up and lead us in closing worship. Oh, yeah. Questions real quick. What did you learn here about trauma and how it shows up? Did anything surprise you? Or how did the lens of trauma-informed care impact your perspective on Jesus and his ministry, whether it's the stories we looked at or just thinking about that in general? Or what might it look like to move from asking what's wrong with you to what happened to you in your relationships? So those are the questions to consider, but of course you're welcome to talk about anything that feels relevant.